lumberman, and most of his fortune, and I'm just going to guess what went to build this house, was earned after a particular fire in a particular city across the lake, reputedly started by a cow.
Reservation Detroit, and we're actually the city's, actually the region's oldest architectural preservation advocacy group.
Wow.
We've been around since 1975. We advocate for, so part of our role is not just interesting historical spots and conversation and lectures and things like that, but it is also an advocacy organization. So the Detroit Historic Commission, for instance, we have a liaison that corresponds with that organization when the city or someone else is considering tearing down a building, putting up a parking lot, as the song goes. We've had some success, and we've had some sadness for sure. Places that we really hoped were going to stand the test of time. Either somebody got there first and tore it down and asked for forgiveness later, or it just wasn't viable. The city or whoever it was just decided it just had to come down. In any event, we started in 1975, and the organization was actually started by about 10 grad students from Wayne State, and it started over a dispute over a building that is no longer on our route, but it was an old Queen Anne style home that was originally lived in by David Mackenzie, who was the first principal for Central High School in Detroit. And the house, according to the university, was going to have to be moved because they were going to build a dorm in the spot next to it.
You mean removed, Terrace? Torn down?
I'm sorry, removed, right?
Oh, okay.
Because now it's been moved, but they
the one building that's sitting on the
Forest. It's okay. Forest.
Yeah. Yep.
It was on Cass.
Okay.
Right.
Originally when it was built, and for the first
100 years.
Almost.
Oh wow.
Yeah, 80 years. Anyway, yeah.
And so there was a sewer. They were going to dig a sewer line in order to service the dorm that was going in next door.
And they were just going to tear the house down.
Tear the house
down.
Wow. Yeah. In their minds, there was no good reason to keep it.
And there were many houses in the area that were being torn down by the university. That was just one that became a target, a center for it.
Excuse us. So, as luck would have it, and as diligence would have it, these students were able to convince the university not to tear it down, and it became the headquarters for then Preservation Wayne.
Nice.
And then as the years went by and the focus really solidified as far as the organization was concerned, really became Detroit focused, and the decision was made to change it to Preservation Detroit. Again, all volunteer based, folks come from all walks. We've had students, retired contractors, lawyers/realtors. There's our tour director was an archivist for Gale Research. I mean, it's just the common thread, though, is that just about everyone in our group that you've talked to, I think without exception, will say either they grew up in the area, left the area, came back, always had been interested in architecture, always had been interested in history, or they've always been here and had no idea or didn't have as developed an idea of the rich history of the area, or they knew a ton of stuff. You know, Gary worked in this area for years as a contractor, in this area specifically.
Nice.
Renovating and reworking old buildings and houses. And so, literally seeing things from the inside, which I envy terribly every time we talk about it. So, anyway, so the organization, like I said, has been around since 1975. We really appreciate and seek out more volunteers. If you're interested in doing what we do, we have a kickoff event every April, and it's basically a recruiting time. You can come in and hear what we're about, more what we're about, find out about the tour specifically. And additionally, we have talks and other events that happen over the years. Over the course of the year. So there's always our website and our organization is a good information resource. We'll link and direct you towards other organizations as well, like the Detroit Historical Society, the Burton Historical Collection at the Detroit Public Library, the Detroit History Museum. There's so much information that's digitally, you can just sit there and just scroll. Instead of Facebook, go to the Detroit Historical Society site, honestly. So that brings us to this area and this tour. So we have 4 discrete tours. We have Midtown, we have the downtown tour, we have Eastern Market, and then we also have the Cultural Center, which of course adjoins this neighborhood, adjoins and overlaps to an extent. And the origins of this neighborhood will take a minute to get to, because this is a city that's 323 years old, at least if you're going to go by the official reckoning of Antoine Cadillac getting here in 1701. So, but for hundreds and thousands of years, like many other places in what is now the United States, of course, these were indigenous lands.
Anishinaabe.
Right, and there were a number of nations, however, that either passed through, stayed in this area on an itinerant basis, hunted in this area, traded in this area. So you had Huron, you had, and I'll try and do better about the Anishinaabe pronunciations, but Ojibwe, which are Chippewa, Odawa, which is Ottawa, and then Potawatomi is actually the pronunciation instead of Ottawa. And some Miami Indians Native Americans lived here as well, and they were transitory. So they were, depending on the season, depending on the trading, this was a gathering and a transit spot for all these people, and a habitation for all these people as well. So in 1701, a little bit before 1701, Antoine Cadillac had conversations and other correspondence with the French government, and the plan and the suggestion was to come to this area to capitalize on the resources that were here. One of the primary resources that they wanted to capitalize on were beavers, because beaver felt was so prized in Europe, especially in France, but throughout Europe, because beaver pelt and beaver felt was used in military hats. So all these military hats that the majority of the French military wore ended up becoming super popular among just the general population. Fashionable men and women decided that they wanted, the newest trend, and so as that demand rose, the government saw an opportunity not only to claim some land, but also claim some resources. And so Louis XIV, the Sun King, said, all right, go, take some money, take some people, take some soldiers, off he goes. And so he lands at what is around it's around where Griswold hits the river, if it were to hit the river, and if it were to still hit the river, and he arrives, and shortly after he arrives in 1701, his wife arrives, and they begin to immediately develop a spot to live, an encampment and a fortification. A church is commissioned and built. A lot of things were happening right away. Well, it wasn't until 1707 when some of the earliest French farmers were arriving and were promised land that Cadillac, under the authority of the French government, started to grant these strips of land, basically these farms. They started at the Detroit River and they went north about 1.5 miles. They were about 200 to 600 feet wide. These were just these little narrow strips of land, but they were side by side by side by side. They had an access road that ran along the sides of these. They were ribbons. Then they were eventually called, or we called them anyway, ribbon farms. This is the way they were laid out. The farmhouse was right or close to the foot of the property, closest to the river, and the farm extended behind it. And keep in mind what you would need as far as transportation or getting your crops to market or trading with others. You need a transportation route, and the river was just that. I mean, it had already been in use for 60 years as a European, folks who were coming here to develop these areas or take advantage of them were already using the Great Lakes to great extent and going up and down and through the straits. So, but there were also, I mean, consider that, you know, we're living on top of and driving and building on top of and have over the last 3 centuries. There are multiple rivers and streams that are buried.
That's a good point.
You know, including one that runs or ran basically under where the Buell building is downtown.
Yeah.
And one that runs through Elmwood Cemetery, you know, a bit east of us, close to Lafayette and Mount Elliott. Parent Creek ran under and through between the Detroit River and what is now the cemetery.
Okay.
But it's mostly buried. You see this little stream of it that goes through the cemetery.
Right.
But we had rivers and streams. So
you can hear running water in the sewers downtown.
yeah, I mean, it's a remarkable sound. It really is. So I'm not sure about, you know, specific infrastructure as far as the farms are concerned other than that. But again, they extended about 1.5 miles. More settlers continued to show up. In 1711, however, Cadillac gets reposted to Louisiana, and I think he was eventually recalled to France, where but I think he's buried. I think he's actually buried in Louisiana. If not, no, actually he's back in France.
Did he get recalled because he failed here in some capacity?
He had some issues.
Okay.
Yeah, he had some issues. Yeah, I can't remember either. So
it was related to Detroit or not.
Okay.
Right. So, in any event, farmers continue to arrive, and consider that these ribbon farms actually initially ran from basically Lake St. Clair in the north down to basically where the Ambassador Bridge is right now, and eventually, and they were used in other places in the state and in the country as well, this format for these farms, and eventually they extended all the way to the Clinton River, you know, up in the northeastern suburbs, and all the way down to Lake Erie. So that, and they were on both sides of the river here, really. So they developed them on what was the British side, and then they were also all along the Windsor and Amherstburg sides of the river. So 1760, the British government succeeds to this area, and you know, there were some notable things that happened, but for our purposes, as this area continued to develop and more families moved in, and keep in mind the names of some of these families, and consider the names of a lot of the streets that you see, and then consider this idea of ribbon farms again, because they're all connected. When you see Shane was a French family. Quinder was a French family. Rivard was a French family. And those names, of course, have lasted through the centuries. Those were their farms. Those were I don't know if they were necessarily the access roads where those roads are now, but they took on the names of these originally French families. So 1796, the U.S. government has been formed, and the U.S. has now succeeded to all this land. And in 1807, the U.S. Land Grant Office is established. And in 1812, all of the folks who originally got these land grants, they had to apply to the U.S. government to get approved to basically keep them and anyone else who was going to get more land also had to get a land grant from the U.S. government. One of the benefits, though, however, in getting this land grant is that they petitioned the government. They said, we want more, we'd like more land. So they eventually extended these farms another 1.5 miles out. So now you have about a 3-mile strip going from the river to essentially just north of what is now West Grand Boulevard. So the world, of course, is doing what the world is doing. You know, this country has just come out of a revolution. Folks are starting to move to this area, granted not a lot. In 1805, when the city of Detroit, as it was, sadly burned to the ground, there were only about 1,500 people living here. And there was nevertheless a strong desire to rebuild, and they did eventually rebuild, but then these areas which were farms were reconsidered as the population continued to grow. So one particular farm, which was owned by the St. Martin family originally, was sold to the McComb family. So William and Alexander McComb, primarily his brother William, owned this tract, and they also owned Belle Isle and Grosse Ile and a lot of other land. Actually, William McComb was one of the wealthiest people in Michigan, if not in the territories. So in 1816, actually, Lewis Cass purchased this property from the McComb family. And Lewis Cass, interesting individual, a lot of ambition, a lot of success in various areas in life. He was a statesman, he was Secretary of War, Secretary of Defense, he was an ambassador, he was a presidential candidate. However, he also owned enslaved people. It was still permissible, but it is a very unfortunate part of course, our nation's history, and then even the city of Detroit's history, that human beings were still bought and sold even here in the early 1800s. Lewis was off doing what he was doing around the world and in federal government, and so his family handled essentially leasing of plots of land on this tract until Lewis died in 1866. His daughter Mary now had inherited this property, and Mary had been managing these leases, but then she got the idea, and folks actually asked her, as the city grew and people wanted more land, and especially people of means who decided, oh, we don't want to live where all those other people live. They're all messy and loud, and they bring their families, and we want nicer, shinier, fancier places. I'm paraphrasing it horribly, of course, what might have been said. And so the Cass family started selling plots of land, and for these folks to build these incredible houses, including what is one of the most intact blocks of Queen Anne and High Victorian houses in the whole city. And we're going to actually walk down that way. But in the 1870s, started to develop these pieces of property, and up through about 1888, these homes built one after one by lawyers and doctors and superintendents of telegram companies and things like that. So coming in finally into the 20th century, as the area continued to develop and Detroit industry continued to develop, and we were doing extraordinary things even before this guy from Ohio and Dearborn decided that things should take a turn. So we were one of the #1 producers of cigars in the country. We were one of the #1, if not the #1 producer of heating stoves in the country. We produced more freight cars for the railroad industry than anybody else. We were #1 in industry before we had the #1 industry in the world. So this drew population, right? folks knew that there were jobs here, there was money here, there was the potential to develop here, so they started more and more coming here. So about 1914, of course, by that time, the automobile industry had exploded. And Ford was producing more cars than all these other fledgling companies in the world. And actually, Ford, in a building that we're going to pass by today, that was the Willis Overland Company. Willis was the second largest automobile producer in the country. So car companies bring car dealerships and car maintenance facilities and showrooms, and those all started to filter out to this area as well. So you're building showrooms and factories. This was actually the Buick warehouse and dealership across the street before it was converted into lofts. That's the Canfield Lofts, and it was originally, again, it was a showroom and a dealership and a workspace, and it's been redeveloped into lofts. It used to just have 2 floors, but they actually had to do something to upgrade the HVAC and mechanicals, so they put them on the roof, and then they built these other lofts around them. So that 3rd floor is actually an addition as that developed. But this is what was happening. Apartment buildings were coming in. The 1920s to 30s, of course, as the population just blew off the map as far as the city of Detroit is concerned, were really heady times. And of course, the world keeps progressing, and we head into depression in 1929, of course. And from the 1930s to 1960s, Detroit, like much of the world, struggled because of the changes that were going on. This area actually fell on pretty hard times. I mean, starting in the 30s, but it had always had an artist community, and where other places and people and things move out, the artists say, it's kind of cheap rent. Exactly, cheap rent. So the art community actually started to flourish and have a real serious impact in the 30s up through the 60s. Of course, the rebellion in the city of Detroit in 1967, and even population decline as the city spread outward, and the demographics changed in the area, and the industry rose and fell. All those things continued to change this area and the city and the region. And so this area kind of limped along until, I would say, the 80s. There was some, folks would come in and they would start to reconsider some buildings, but nothing very intense happened here, I don't think, until maybe the 1990s, where folks like Bob Slattery came in and started to redevelop some of these properties into apartment buildings and condos and lofts that were these old industrial buildings. That continued until the bottom fell out again. So 2008 hit Detroit almost harder than any other place in the country as far as the housing market was concerned, as far as our economy is concerned. Struggled a bit, development kind of stalled, and then around 2011, 2012, it really started to pick back up again. So because of private development, private investors, and organizations like Midtown Detroit and Sue Mosey, just retired from the organization, the area is now, it's just on redevelopment and on the upswing again. And I'll acknowledge, I mean, it's gotten to a point where I would love to live here, but I can't afford it. It's it's wonderful, but it's bittersweet, because a lot of changes will take away from maybe some of the nostalgia of the area. There are lots of new people coming in from out of state, lots of investment dollars from out of the area. So Anyway, that's as tiny of a nutshell as I can give 323 years as far as this area is concerned. But consider as we walk through, it's still a neighborhood. It did have houses, more houses than it does right now. It still has a bunch of churches. Some of them have been converted. Even with the influx of apartment buildings and more people, it's a neighborhood. It now has a major research university that is in and around it, of course, Wayne State University, and has continued growth and impact and change. But that, I want you to keep in mind, people live here, and they work here, and they go to school here. It has always been, since the time that houses started to be built here in the 1870s in earnest, it's always been a neighborhood. That's how I see it. So it's a place where people live, not just a spot to drive through.
Look diagonal across the street, and what looks like an old mansion. This actually was initially built in the early 1900s as an apartment building, and it was built as an apartment building. It just had 4 what were luxury apartments, including had servants' quarters. It was built for folks who were waiting for their mansions to be built, basically, in the area. And so it was built, believe it or not, as transitional housing, as luxurious as these apartments were. That particular building became a funeral home. It was a funeral home for a number of years, and now it's the Pi Kappa Alpha fraternity house as part of Wayne State. Young men keep it in pretty good repair. I see some solo cups out there this morning, but it is the weekend, and it is near the end of the semester. I think we're in finals right now. But the fraternity, I think the university actually owns it, but the fraternity has been there for 8-10 years, maybe longer, in that particular spot. That's a good example of at least people who are having, again, their homes built, who are coming to live in the area permanently, ideally. They lived there for a time. Right next door, though, in 1916, the Knickerbocker apartments were built. And the Knickerbocker, of course, it looks much different. It doesn't have only 4 large apartments. There's 22 smaller apartments. And those apartments were built for the working folks, for the administrative workers who were working closer to the downtown area, closer to the city center. They needed a place to live that wasn't so far from downtown. So the Knickerbocker was built. There were other apartment buildings that went up at different times. This apartment building right here, probably the 19-teens. But again, smaller apartments, built more for workers and administrative professionals, things like that, as opposed to the folks who were here permanently living in larger structures. This corner, actually right behind us, where you have, oh, you all right?
I got stuck in my knee, sorry.
Oh, man.
University Towers is actually an apartment building now for graduate housing and some professional offices. It also houses the studios for my favorite radio station, WDET.
This building here?
Yep.
The University Tower?
Yep. So you can see the satellite right there off to the right. And then
it's around the other side of it.
yeah, exactly. But this, as you might imagine, this glass and concrete tower was not here until relatively recently. In 1883, this was actually a field. This was the ball field for the Detroit Athletic Club. It also was the athletic field for Central High School, which right down, let's use that sandstone colored building that we still affectionately call Old Main. It had a building on it by 1911, I believe, that housed one of the Detroit International Auto Shows. So it was a convention center for a time. It was then, it went somewhat unused until It was redeveloped into a bottling plant for a little soda company that we like to call Vernors. I should say pop. I'm from here. It's pop. It was a pop producer known as Vernors. And Vernors not only occupied the building here on what was this parking lot in this building, but also where this other development that is now an apartment building on Woodward, that was bottling and administration that fronted right on Woodward itself. And whether you remember or whether you don't remember, whether it's some few memory that you still have in your brain, there used to be a 55-foot tall neon gnome that used to pour a bottle of Vernors, with neon fizz coming out of it, etc. Something like that.
Wow.
So it was this neon sign. One, it was 55 feet tall, and it produced so much heat that it actually had its own air conditioning system. So Vernors was here for from the 50s, right here on this spot, from the 50s until roughly the 80s. They had been sold. Some of their they were also the producers of RC Cola, and RC Cola had been sold off. Vernors had been sold off to a national branding company, and by 1985, 1987, the building was empty. And there were some thoughts. See, this had already been torn down behind it, but the building on Woodward, there was some thoughts to turn it into housing, turn it into something else, keep the building as much as they could, and redevelop it. Those never came to fruition, and by the early 90s, it was being torn down. In its place, though, you can see that apartment building that will actually pass by. So in 1997, when that apartment building was built, 97 a little bit later, it was actually the first market rent housing, apartment housing in the city of Detroit for 30 years.
Wow.
It wasn't just in Midtown, it was in the whole city. That was the first market rate building that was put in. Either folks were either redeveloping properties, or they just weren't doing anything. Their buildings were already there. So, and yes, my brain is pretty intact, but I still have notes because there are a lot of fun things I want to talk about. So, in any event, this gives you an idea, even in a microcosm, of how this area developed. From folks moving from downtown, building houses out this way, needing apartment buildings to house them, folks who were workers living in smaller apartments, sites going through development phases, industry leaving, university buildings coming in. It's just this constant move forward and developing and redeveloping these areas. Across the street, just as an example, not a big fan of this kind of architecture, but it's important to note that here was another spot that had kind of nondescript buildings on it for a period of time, but eventually torn down. The Auburn, when it was built, let's see, the Auburn went in the early 2000s. It has, I think there are 40 one-bedroom, two-bedroom, and studio apartments. Typical development style these days, with retail on the lower level and living above. Very consistently occupied though, whether it's by students or instructors or folks who just want to live in this area. So the good thing is that with all this development, whether I like it or not, meaning like what it looks like, because I'm a nostalgic person as far as architecture is concerned, people are living in it, as opposed to the area being kind of emptied out for a long time. Yeah. So, all right, let's stroll and sway. Sometimes affectionately called the Three Ladies. When this was built, it was originally a coal-fired steam plant, and the steam was originally set up to heat just 12 customers who lived in this area, 12 buildings.
Wow.
And houses, right? about 3,000 feet of steam pipes into this tract, into this area. In just a year, they actually added, God, the number was crazy. So in just a year, demand had increased so much that they increased these pipes to 10,000 feet. And then by the 1940s, this plant connected to other plants throughout the city. There were 42 miles of steam pipes that emanated from these various plants. And if you don't know this about the city, the plants produce so much steam that there's actually an industry for selling the steam to businesses. So there's a company called Detroit Thermal that developed out of the steam generation from the utility. And it's still, it's still used in all these buildings. Or in many of these buildings, you got steam heat and boilers.
So what do they do? Capture the steam?
Yeah.
Oh.
Wow.
How do you do that?
Okay.
I don't know. Capture it, with as it's pumped through pipes, I would imagine, and regulated by valves.
Mostly the heat.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
So what is that building being used for now?
It's still a plant.
Okay.
It's not coal-fired anymore. It's fuel oil. It actually had its boiler rebuilt in 1916.
Okay.
And has had, I'm sure, in the 100 years since. But it still operates as a power plant.
Wow.
So, but the city is, not only is it a grid of, God, I'm glad they have that there. The city, is not only a grid of these kinds of an electrical grid. There are these generating plants throughout the city. So, for instance, there's one that this is basically connected to it at the Boulevard and Second. So, about 3 miles from where we are, about a mile from where we are right now. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Whitney carriage house right here, but I'm going to leave it to you guys. Just going to check it out as we walk. So this is the Whitney Mansion, at least the back of it. It was finished eventually in 1894. It was a residential home for one family, for the David Whitney family.
Wow.
And it is just, it's as extraordinary inside as it looks outside. It was extraordinary when it was built. It's built out of pink jasper, which is, as I understand it, one of the hardest stones to quarry and cut and put in place. It was originally built for what in 1894 dollars was $1 million, basically. But in 2024, that $1 million equates to about $35 million. That is nothing compared to what it cost to furnish it. So, and what's inside this building, if you haven't been in, incredible old wood and plaster and at one point in its history, tapestries, statuary, and other adornments that all told were $6 million in furnishings, but which equate to $220 million today.
Wow.
So the house, amazing. Inside, even more so. It has 42 rooms, 20 fireplaces, 10 bathrooms. It's a private restaurant. It's a public restaurant, but it's now used as a restaurant. It's been a restaurant since maybe, yeah. So it's been a restaurant since 1987, actually. The Whitney, yeah.
Oh, wow, they're blocking traffic. That's
that I learned about recently, actually, there's a bit more history about the this was actually, when it was built in the 1890s to support the house, this was actually...
Yeah, we paid extra to have that.
Right. This carriage house is actually one of the most advanced carriage houses anywhere. It still is one of the, it actually today is probably one of the largest and maybe last remaining carriage houses that had horse stalls in it, anywhere in the city. And the advances in technology that they used, actually there was an elevator, it's still there, it's not, I don't know that it's used anymore, but the elevator actually would lift off-season carriages into place. So your winter carriages, it's summertime, put those things in storage, and they lift those into place and bring the warmer weather carriages down. It's still used by the Whitneys, still owned by them. It is the source of some stories, and those stories are nothing less than ghost stories as far as I'm concerned. There's a particular table with a tea setting on it in the carriage house. It's not a good idea to move this setting. If it doesn't stay in place, the stories are that things start to move and doors start to close and dishes start to fall and things like that. It is believed that actually the ghost of David Whitney and his late wife still make their way around the house. The stories are so prevalent that actually the top floor of the building is now called the Ghost Bar. I don't know that you can see anybody when you're there. I don't know that you'll see apparitions. However, the Ghost Bar is one of my favorite bars in the whole city.
It's nice.
You don't even have to have dinner at the restaurant. You can come in when they're open, have drinks. Frequently there's either a duo or a trio in there playing music. It's, you know, when I said I would take us past the interesting and historically significant and sexier spots in the city. To me, that's one of the sexiest, most romantic spots in the whole city. You can go there with friends, but if you're going to go on date night, I think it's a terrific spot to go. They have a particular drink, among others, that if you're going to have more than one, you should probably have a chaperone. It's called the Witching Hour, and it's made with a couple of different terrific liqueurs, a lemon liqueur, a raspberry liqueur, vodka, and then it's rimmed with sugar, and it'll sneak up on you.
That comes with the tour too, right? We get a taste test.
Oh. Today? Yes, yeah, maybe. If you look through like the trees there and see that square, you can see that is a DW for David Whitney.
Carved into the side of the building.
Carved in the side there. So
Just the other side of the main.
there are a lot of these little emblems around the surface of the building. I remember when they were putting new HVAC in the building. You know, it's such an immense space, and the carrier had to be put in just so. They actually used a helicopter to lift that into place.
Oh wow!
So, and it serves this immense house. A bunch of money in the 1860s, 1870s. David Whitney was primarily a lumberman, and most of his fortune, and I'm just going to guess what went to build this house, was earned after a particular fire in a particular city across the lake, reputedly started by a cow.
Wow.
So when Chicago burned to the ground in October of 1871, it needed to be rebuilt. And much of the white pine that went to rebuild the city of Chicago was supplied by David Whitney's company. It's now a full-time restaurant. Fine dining, linen tables, terrific service, great food. I think we're going to find out. I think we're going to need a beer at their happy hour or something. But they have, over the warmer months, it's either Thursdays or Fridays, they have, as Gary was saying, they have these garden parties. So I think like for $5 or $6 you can get in, and then they have entertainment and I think snacks and beverages available. But this is a particularly unique spot in the city. But as grand as this house is, remember this area, like Wayne's campus, like up and down Woodward, up and down Cass, west of here, east of here, this was a neighborhood. There were houses, there were churches. And
You gotta love it.
they brought back the guy one of the guys who started Slow Roll. They started doing it again on Thursday night. So if you've got a bike and sometime on a Thursday night, when you come back from Austin,
Woodward's pretty lively today, huh?
it is a little. It is a little.
Saturday.
It's a good opportunity to spend some time. This is a good, really short summary though of the residence itself. It is on the Registry of Historic Places. It's worth another look. Before it became what it is now, once it was built in 1894, David Whitney only lived about 6 years, and then he died. But his widow continued to live in the house for another 30 to 40 years. The house was donated, I believe, to the Michigan Home Nurses Association, and then eventually, like a lot of other places, became under the ownership of Wayne State. I don't believe there was a move to tear it down. I mean, like so many things.
It was a VNA.
Right. And then eventually in 1987, I believe, a gentleman by the name of Dick Kuhn bought it. He actually lived in Rosedale. You know where Breton hits Warwick?
Yeah.
There's that big house right on
With
the point. That was his house.
Nice.
So Dick was a manufacturer and a financier. He also owned Lionel Trains, and he actually owned one of the most unique and largest private car collections in the city of Detroit. He used to house it in a warehouse near Grand River and the Southfield Expressway. So, before we move on, I just want to take a look at a couple of things because we'll kind of walk and talk. So, again, this is a city this is an area, of course, that is developing just like every place else. Buildings that were once warehouses or industry or used for some other use have been adapted. Case in point, here is MoCAD, or the Museum of Contemporary Art and Design. This building was refurbished in 2006 and turned into MoCAD, which is actually it's.
One of the more ridiculous.
Oh, it's the woo-woo girls. It's the woo-woo girls. It's that sound. Woo! Woo! So, MoCAD is only an exhibiting museum. They don't have any permanent installations, but that allows them to continually turn over their modern art exhibits. Some of them are more controversial than others. I mean, there's a lot of what I would call statement art. Some of it is, some of it is intentionally provocative, which is great. Some of it is just there to love and observe. Most recently, there was a muralist exhibit. There's a muralist by the name, and she's a pretty rounded artist. Her name is Sydney James. She's from this area. She's produced these extraordinary murals all over the city and in other cities. And if you guys are driving around today, and if you head north on Woodward and take a right on the boulevard, you'll quickly see about 4 blocks down, you'll see this 100-foot tall mural, and it's called The Girl with the D Earring. And it's a takeoff on Vermeer's girl with the pearl earring. It is extraordinary. It is just, I mean, it's this beautiful rendering of the same kind of silhouette that was in Vermeer's painting. But again, 100 feet high, and has this cool neon D earring, the old English D for the city of Detroit that she's wearing. And then look down at the bottom as well, and you'll see the renderings of these businesses that really aren't there anymore, but that were Detroit history and tradition. So, like the Apex Bar is a good example. Long-standing bar in the city of Detroit. This building to the north is a good example of industry growth and the need for new office buildings and administrative buildings. So this building on the right-hand side, this originally was the Edwin George building. So this building was first commissioned in 1908 to be built. It just had 2 floors. And it was commissioned, the architect who was commissioned to do this design work, you've heard his name a lot, you're going to hear his name a lot, and it's easier to talk about the buildings that he didn't design. And you know, those are got maybe, you know, a handful or more in the city than the buildings he did design, and of course that's Albert Kahn. So if you hear his name, especially when you're talking about industrial and commercial buildings, although he did a fair amount of residential sites as well. Kahn designed buildings all over Detroit, all over the country, and he actually designed and had built about 30 or 40 industrial buildings actually in the Soviet Union. He was commissioned to go build industrial plants during the Soviet era. The building design and construction itself was unique and so innovative that if you see a Kahn building, even if the windows are blown out, the outer walls have come off, the internal structure is probably still visible and still there. And it's characterized by this, it almost looks like a martini glass. And it's this concrete pillar that goes up and branches out. Looks just like a martini glass. Those pillars on top of them, as far as the skeleton of the building and the metal trusses, were originally designed by his brother Julius Kahn. And so the two of them together, whenever they were commissioned to design buildings, it was this support structure and then this truss structure by these two brothers. They're going to be here when this building is gone, when the gas stations are gone. They are that solid. So this two-floor building, originally the George Building in 1908. In 1914, there was already a desire to expand this building. So the new owner, Garfield, went to Kahn and said, "Can you put some more floors on the building?" So Kahn said, "Well, sure." So he designed 3 more floors to go on the top of these 2 floors. And you can see how faithfully the terracotta, the outside, matches the lower level. It's been an office building for years. It is now actually lofts. These are loft condos in this building. Again, holding steady to retail on the bottom and living space above. Again, remember this site we were talking about when we were over at Cass. This was the Verner's Bottling and Administration building until they took it down, and then in the late 90s built this apartment. So the population of this city was 2 million people. And as that population grew, though, basically from the 20s to the 50s, as industry grew and population grew, they had to do some things. Like they had to expand roads. They had to add addresses. So there were old addresses in the city. Like if you went to 61 Woodward, what was 61 Woodward before 1920, 1921, it's probably 400 Woodward or something along those lines, because they added so many addresses because the city was expanding. They added so much population. Consistent with that, in 1938, or 1936, excuse me, they had to widen Woodward Avenue. Woodward Avenue was just a couple of lanes, they widened it to now what it is, which is by basically 8 lanes across. And we put an electric streetcar right down the middle of it, including all of the electrical service poles and wires that ran from the foot of Woodward all the way north. But in order to widen it, some things had to happen. There were some buildings in the way. There were fronts of buildings either that were right in the path that had to be torn down, or they cut the front of the buildings right off. Closer to what is now Comerica Park, or St. John's Church. And St. John's, they actually extended a bit further into what is now Woodward. They cut the front of the building off and pushed it back because the street had to go through. This building, though, right across the street, Garfield, who owned the building, was actually, I think it was the story goes, was on the planning commission. And see, he said, "No way are you messing with my building." So instead of cutting it off and running the road through the front of his building or tearing it down, they jogged the street. They jogged Woodward over to an extent where if you look, really you can see it from here. Woodward goes this way and then it goes that way. And it's because of this building right here in Garfield's insistence that they've not left here to build it. You can see, I talked about this being a neighborhood. We've talked about this being a neighborhood. And part of a neighborhood is churches, right? Places of worship. So you have on this corner, you have the First Congregational Church. This church originally was closer to the foot of Woodward. Careful. And its first 2 buildings actually were built on Christmas Day, and they were consecrated on Christmas Day in 1844. But they were closer to the foot of Woodward, closer to the water. And First Congregational Church actually was one of the national forerunners and supporters of the abolitionist movement in the 1800s. And they were so dedicated to it and so intent on abolition happening that they actually they hid fugitive enslaved people in the basement of their church that was down near the water, waiting for one of the conductors to take them across to midnight, as it was called, still called, but at midnight as it was called, which was freedom, basically, in what was part of the British Empire, so Windsor. The church grew in its population, its congregation, and eventually, in the late 1890s, built the First Congregational Church out of red sandstone. It is an extraordinarily beautiful building inside. It looks like, even though it's fairly ornate, it looks like a fairly simple building as churches go. But the stained glass and the woodwork in the ceiling and the murals in the ceiling is still an open parish, still has congregants, and actually, as we get a little north of it, you can see their activities building that was built in the 20s and designed by Khan. Still in use, still this gorgeous building with plaster and hardwoods and all these amenities. And, you know, my favorite thing about these buildings is that while some of them have fallen by the wayside, been torn down, the ones that have been loved on and stayed and been refurbished even, they're 125 years old. I mean, and they're still in use. They're still being talked about and used and loved on. Behind all of this, and adjacent to it, was a district that was called the Sugar Hill Arts District. And we would be remiss if we didn't talk about it. So the Sugar Hill Arts District and Business District was predominantly an African-American business district. It was predominantly owned by African Americans. Still, a lot of the buildings that remain, unfortunately, there are only about 14 buildings that really still remain and comprise the old district. And there are apartment buildings, there were houses, there were clubs and restaurants. But the district itself was a draw for people from all over the country, and this area was a huge draw for musicians and musical talent And these were the big ones. You know, these were Louis Armstrong. These were Ray Charles, John Lee Hooker, these huge names in blues and jazz, and folks made their way to this area because the Sugar Hill District had these clubs where these artists performed. Cobb's Corner that Gary was talking about earlier, this was also this prominent jazz spot where folks like Marcus Belgrave performed, where Lyman Woodard performed. Marcus Belgrave at one time, I'm trying to remember if he was a trumpeter for Ray Charles before he was a performer in his own right. And the jazz performers would perform at what is now, I can't remember the name of the hall. There was a venue down Woodward from us, and actually, if they were performing music hall and other venues in the city, these jazz performers would come in. They'd put on this amazing set to the ticketed crowd, and then come over to Cobb's Corner and they'd play till 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning at an impromptu jam session. That's the power of this city and the draw of this city, and that really should not be forgotten. And no less of it happened in this amazing arts district that really is now underneath what is the VA hospital. And so, right, and I-75, right? So this terrific hospital serving a really important community, unfortunately, is built on top of another community. But that's how we do things. You know, Native Indigenous people, French settlers, you know, folks who came here from the pre-industrial, post-industrial South to the area that was Harmony Park and Black Bottom, that had a freeway built on top of it in the quest for what was called urban renewal. And here we are, you know, 80 years after that, and the thought is, well, all right, that was probably a mistake. Let's take the freeway out. You know, sorry. We've lost a lot, but the recollection and the memories are still here, and hopefully there are enough folks who are determined to either revive that or recognize and acknowledge what was here. So, let's keep on. So the population of this city was 2 million people. And as that population grew, though, you know, basically from the 20s to the 50s, as industry grew and population grew, they had to do some things. Like, they had to expand roads. They had to add addresses. So there were old addresses in the city. Like, if you went to 61 Woodward, what was 61 Woodward before 1920, 1921, it's probably 400 Woodward or something along those lines, because they added so many addresses because the city was expanding, they added so much population. Consistent with that, in 1938, or 1936, excuse me, they had to widen Woodward Avenue. Woodward Avenue was just a couple of lanes. They widened it to now what it is, which is by basically 8 lanes across. And we put an electric streetcar right down the middle of it, including all of the electrical service poles and wires that ran from the foot of Woodward all the way north. But in order to widen it, some things had to happen. There were some buildings in the way. There were fronts of buildings either that were right in the path that had to be torn down, or they cut the front of the buildings right off. Closer to what is now Comerica Park, there's St. John's Church. In St. John's, they actually extended a bit further into what is now Woodward. They cut the front of the building off and pushed it back because the street had to go through. This building, though, right across the street, Garfield, who owned the building, was actually, I think as the story goes, was on the planning commission. And see, he said, "No way are you messing with my building." So instead of cutting it off and running the road through the front of his building or tearing it down, they jogged the street. They jogged Woodward over to an extent where if you look, really you can see it from here. Woodward goes this way and then it goes that way. And it's because of this building right here in Garfield's insistence that they've not let tear the building. You can see, I talked about this being a neighborhood. We've talked about this being a neighborhood. And part of a neighborhood is churches, right? Places of worship. So you have on this corner, you have the First Congregational Church. This church originally was closer to the foot of Woodward. Careful. And its first two buildings actually were built on Christmas Day, and they were consecrated on Christmas Day in 1844. But they were closer to the foot of Woodward, closer to the water. And First Congregational Church actually was one of the national forerunners and supporters of the abolitionist movement in the 1800s. And they were so dedicated to it and so intent on abolition happening that they actually they hid fugitive enslaved people in the basement of their church that was down near the water, waiting for one of the conductors to take them across to midnight, as it was called, still called, but at midnight as it was called, which was freedom, basically, in what was part of the British Empire, so Windsor. The church grew in its population, its congregation, and eventually, in the late 1890s, built the First Congregational Church out of red sandstone. It is an extraordinarily beautiful building inside. It looks like, even though it's fairly ornate, it looks like a fairly simple building as churches go. But the stained glass and the woodwork in the ceiling and the murals in the ceiling, it's still an open parish, still has congregants, and actually, as we get a little north of it, you can see their activities building that was built in the 20s and designed by Khan. Still in use, still this gorgeous building with plaster and hardwoods and all these amenities. And, you know, my favorite thing about these buildings is that while some of them have fallen by the wayside, been torn down, the ones that have been loved on and stayed and been refurbished even, they're 125 years old. I mean, and they're still in use. They're still being talked about and used and loved on. Behind all of this and adjacent to it was a district that was called the Sugar Hill Arts District. And we would be remiss if we didn't talk about it. So the Sugar Hill Arts District and Business District was predominantly an African-American business district. It was predominantly owned by African-Americans. Still, a lot of the buildings that remain, unfortunately, there are only about 14 buildings that really still remain and comprise the old district. And there are apartment buildings, there were houses, there were clubs and restaurants. But the district itself was a draw for people from all over the country, and this area was a huge draw for musicians and musical talent, and these were the big ones. You know, these were Louis Armstrong, these were Ray Charles, John Lee Hooker, these huge names in blues and jazz, and folks made their way to this area because the Sugar Hill District had these clubs where these artists performed. Cobb's Corner that Gary was talking about earlier, this was also this prominent jazz spot where folks like Marcus Belgrave performed, where Lyman Woodard performed. Marcus Belgrave at one time, I'm trying to remember if he was a trumpeter for Ray Charles before he was a performer in his own right. And the jazz performers would perform at what is now, I can't remember the name of the hall. There was a venue down Woodward from us, and actually, if they were performing music hall and other venues in the city, these jazz performers would come in, they'd put on this amazing set to the ticketed crowd, and then come over to Cobb's Corner and they'd play till 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning at an impromptu jam session. That's the power of this city and the draw of this city, and that really should not be forgotten. And no less of it happened in this amazing arts district. It really is now underneath what is the VA hospital. And so, right, and I-75, right? So this terrific hospital serving a really important community, unfortunately, is built on top of another community. But that's how we do things. You know, Native American, Native Indigenous people, French settlers, you know, folks who came here from the pre-industrial, post-industrial South to the area that was Harmony Park and Black Bottom, that had a freeway built on top of it in the quest for what was called urban renewal. And here we are, you know, 80 years after that, and the thought is, well, all right, that was probably a mistake. Let's take the freeway out. You know, sorry. We've lost a lot, but the recollection and the memories are still here, and hopefully there are enough folks who are determined to either revive that or recognize and acknowledge what was here. So thankfully no one was hurt, but you know, when your building is 120 years old and it's been sitting in a major industrial city for that long, and cars and everything and people rumble past it every day, sometimes there's some wear and tear. So you can see sort of that different colored stone that's on the right hand corner. That all cracked off and fell onto the steps. Thankfully, through donors both in the church and outside the church, it was fairly quickly redone. It took about a year and a half for them to finally do it. But I think they did a pretty good job. Color, you know, it's tough to match 120-year-old red sandstone from the UP, but they did okay. This bell tower here has a rendering of the Archangel Uriel on top. It's all copper, and until I just learned this on the last tour, until recently, she always faced woodward. And somehow, I don't know how, and I don't know if it was always supposed to be like that, if it was sort of a weather vane, she actually, if it's windy enough, she will turn. So on any particular day, you might see that that figure is facing north or south, or however the wind is blowing. So yeah, it's kind of wild. Right behind us, actually, again, cannot go past some of the places on our tour without mentioning them. So this is the current location, and I say current location because when it started in the 20s and 30s, the Detroit Artist Market was closer to downtown. But here is this extraordinary exhibit and retail space of local artists who the exhibits change out pretty frequently. They're extraordinary folks who exhibit here and have their works sold here. And anybody who knows the Detroit Artist Market, it is a badge of honor actually to have your works shown here. Open just about every day of the week. The retail shop is open and has some smaller renderings of the artists who are on display and who displayed here before. So definitely worth a stop. Stop here, head down to dinner at the Whitney, go up to the Ghost Bar, stop at any of the other restaurants that we're going to pass by. You could spend a whole evening and then some in Midtown and never go out of this several block area. Across the street, you know, again, Grand Rapids, they call the city of churches. Other places they call the city of churches. Detroit has an extraordinary amount of churches, both churches that have gone into, say, old banks and old buildings and redeveloped those buildings, but ones that were originally built as churches, like this one across the street. So this is the Cathedral of the Church of St. Paul. It is the cathedral, or the cathedra, which means big chair, of the Episcopal Diocese of Detroit. So this building, actually, when it was built this was built in 1907, but The Episcopal Church arrived here in 1824. It actually arrived in Michigan territories, so before Northwest Territories, so before Michigan was even a state. It is the oldest Protestant entity to come into the Northwest Territories in the country. So, excuse me, into the Northwest Territories. So 1824 they show up. 1907, after a couple of other buildings, further down Woodward and closer to the river, came and went. In 1907, this building was commissioned, and an architect who builds and is known for building churches, Ralph Adams Cram, actually designed this building. So this is a late Gothic, English Gothic, late Gothic style. It's in that flying buttress or buttress style building. And if you've never seen it before, never heard of it before, its primary aspect is that there are no visible internal supports. The whole idea of this structure is that the walls support the roof and the roof supports the wall. They press against each other intentionally, and it keeps the whole thing up. This is an unbelievable building inside. Its architectural significance is owed to, one, the beauty of the structure, the stained glass windows, and even the floor. So if you start in front of this building and walk all the way to the dais, all the way to the altar at the front, it has Palabic tile. I don't know if everybody's familiar with Palabic tile. The church does. So the floor actually is decked out in Palabic tile. So here's this iconic tile, right? Produced right here in the city of Detroit, late 1800s. Mary Chase Stratton and her partner started developing this iridescent clay and this iridescent firing process, and it caught on like wildfire and was incorporated in buildings throughout the country and throughout the world, and is still in business. They're still in business on East Jefferson. Anyway, so the floor of this building goes all the way from the door all the way to the altar, and it goes from sort of a rusty iridescent brown to this incredible cobalt blue that goes all the way to the altar. It is actually one of the largest installations of Palabic tile in the country. You're right across the street.
Wow.
Yep. So
Okay.
the other ones are like in the National Cathedral in New York, or Washington D.C., excuse me, and in other places around the country. I think the National Cathedral has the largest. But this was an Episcopal church, and Episcopal church were frequently very well-heeled, very well-attended churches. Folks like Henry Ford and his wife Clara attended this church. This was the Ford Church. As a matter of fact, Ford was such a prominent member of this church, and although there are a lot of things in his history and in his reputation that I've come not to appreciate, there was no getting around the fact that his ideas and the industrial might of Ford Motor Company literally put the planet on wheels. And so in 1947, when Henry Ford died in April, they still had the house in Dearborn called Fairlane. So they still had that mansion and property, and well-wishers and mourners showed up at the house. About 5,000 people showed up at the house. But 20,000 people showed up and filled the street outside the church the next morning. So there was still, church was very prominent. Ford family, of course, is very prominent. And it's also had been the family church to the Menon family, so Menon Speed Stick, and you've seen these commercials. That was the Menon family that used this church or attended this church. There's something missing on this church, though, as amazing as it is. As you look at it, gentlemen, can you point out a spot where something seems to be missing?
The original roof?
No, roof's always been there. Well, actually, it's a metal roof. You're right.
Yeah.
So the original roof is not there, but something maybe a little further back in the structure is missing. Bell tower.
Oh, okay.
So the vestry, they could never, so the council for the church, 1928, they were considering improvements and finally considering putting the bell tower up. And they just kept arguing. They just could not, they didn't want to spend the money. And even though money was free-flowing in 1928 before the bottom fell out, they couldn't decide, so it never got built. When you go in today, you actually can tour this church, and if you go in the administrative offices on the back, you can see the original written plans that included the town. But you know, money's money. People still argue about it, so you know. All right, well, let's move on. There were two tile types that are really the most prominent in this area and elsewhere, in my understanding. One of them is Pewabic, and the other one is called flint faience. And flint faience was actually originated in Flint, shocker, by the Champion Spark Plug Company. So the folks who were making Champion spark plugs, somebody in the company said, you know what, we keep firing up the kilns every morning because we're making these ceramic toppers to these spark plugs, and then we turn the kilns off, and then we got to fire them up the next morning. That costs a lot of money. You know, it's a lot of fuel, a lot of time, a lot of money. Let's do something else. And so this person said, well, let's do something creative. And so it was decided that they would keep the kilns on all the time, and they would start to develop this creative tile. So the short answer is, I don't know whether that's flint faience or Pewabic, or just kind of a take on it. But the building, shocker, was designed by Albert Kahn. It was originally a Firestone tire dealership and repair facility. It's now owned by Wayne State. It's run as University Press, which, man, they crank out a ton of good materials. I mean, they really, the writers and the researchers who produce under University Press just cover the gamut of different topics. So if you're just, you know, baby's asleep one day, you're like, I need some new reading material, check out University Press's site. So I'm trying. And headed back into the central campus, really, you see how cohesive this area really is. Even though it's a mixture of houses and apartments and industry and churches, it still works. There's so much to it that has coexisted for decades, that it's really, you can't leave any of it out and just say, well, you know, there's a school there. No, there isn't just a school here. There's art museums and venues, and a couple of really good examples of early architecture. This house actually built in, it's called Richardsonian Romanesque. And the Romanesque style really takes its name from, see the blocks along the bottom? It's designed to resemble old Roman architecture. So these huge cut stones and foam in the base of the house. These were originally single residences. When this gentleman built his house, when Mr. Mulford built this house, he really liked the house that his neighbor had built. And when he finally sold, Mulford bought this house. But then eventually these were subdivided into apartments, and they're still apartments today. Yet another good corner to to discuss and kind of give an example of how areas developed to meet a need, and really covered some of the most important aspects of life, like a church. This was the first Church of Christ Scientists when it was originally built, and it was built initially as a church in 1917. It had a 1,500 seat worship area, and like so many buildings, eventually became, it was purchased by Wayne State and was developed into actually one of the oldest graduate theater programs in the country. So in 1964, when the building was taken over by the university, it became the Hillberry Theater. It was named after one of the first presidents of the university. Lasted for a long time as the Hillberry Theater. It was a 500-seat elliptical auditorium, beautiful woodworking inside. It was a great place to see a play. And then it also had, on the lower level, it had sort of an experimental sort of undergraduate theater called the Studio Theater. And that lasted until about 5 years ago, maybe 4 years ago, when it was decided, mostly because, or largely because, they got a huge chunk of money, the university did, to convert this over to another department of fine and performing arts, but to build this building next door called the Hillberry Gateway. So the Hillberry Gateway is actually built, that's built on the site of our former headquarters. So remember that house, we didn't talk too much about the house, but the house that was going to be demolished, it used to sit right there, right next door to the church. And it was this Queen Anne style house, you know, just a beautiful old wooden frame house. It was there for a long, long time. They literally picked it up, put it on rollers, moved it down the street. So it's now at Forest and 2nd. They dug a big hole, sat it on the side for a while, got the foundation set up, set the house on top of it. I think they're still working on it though. You know, you're trying to open. Is it? Okay, great. That's great. I think it's completed. Okay. But the Hillberry Gateway is a state-of-the-art theater and music venue. Again, so all these plays that the Graduate Theater puts on, plus their music program, plus dance. They have recording studios in the building. It was built, I think the price tag was something like $45 million. Most of it was donated, however, by Gretchen Valade. If you don't know that name, that's okay, because I didn't either until recently. So Gretchen was actually the granddaughter of Hamilton Carhart. That name might be familiar too. So Carhart clothing, that Carhart, perfect example, right?
There you go.
So Carhart's been producing that clothing for industry and others for over 100 years. Made a bundle of money doing it. Gretchen, his granddaughter, who eventually married Robert Valade, who was the CEO of Carhartt until he died. Well, until he retired. Gretchen loved music. She loved predominantly jazz, and she was a huge supporter of Detroit's Jazz Festival, huge supporter of what is now the Aretha, which was called Shane Park for a long time, and she donated the money to build the Hillberry Gateway. Just an extraordinary person, extraordinary patron of the arts. She just died in 2022. She was 97 years old and still going.
So, Carhartt a Detroit company, or did
Carhartt's a Detroit company, originated here in Detroit. Yep.
It's still privately owned too.
Still
right?
privately owned. Exactly. So here's a church. Across the street, actually built a little earlier, was what is now called the Thompson Home, but it was called the Thompson Home for Old Ladies. So when this was originally built, David Thompson had said to his wife before he died, look, when I die, I want you to do something worthwhile with the money. I want you to build something that serves the community. And so his wife, when he died, took the money and built, and the description of the house just cracks me up. So it was not the most politically correct phrase, but it was 1884 when the house was built. So it was built as a place where friendless old ladies could pass their remaining days in peace and comfort. This house was not designed by Albert Kahn. This was designed by George Mason, who was actually a mentor of Kahn. Was an architect as well. It was built an estimated $330,000 when it was built. It was built because there was no Social Security in the country. There was no widow's benefit. There was no pension to speak of for women who died, and husbands were the primary, whose husbands were the primary breadwinners. If they had some resources, though, they had the opportunity to come live here at the Thompson home, and it was pretty luxurious. When it was originally built, they all had private apartments. There was a dining service that, you know, an in-home kitchen that served the building. There was a solarium, so there were sunrooms off the back for gathering. Eventually, they had an infirmary built to serve the residents. Only women, only widows, and it continued as a senior residence until actually the 1970s. And again, you know, the city was having its times, and it really just couldn't be supported anymore. So, the university in the area saw an opportunity, bought another building, bought this building, turned it into the School of Social Work. It was the School of Social Work until, oh man, I think it was, well, School of Social Work until, I didn't believe it was this long until I saw it today, 2015. And so the house was again, the building was again refurbished. It was actually used to be yellow, I think. It was like an ugly yellow. So it was repainted this rust red color when it was redone. It was now, and so it's now housing for fine and performing arts students. And as we walk past it, I'm really glad to point out when we get there that there was an idea to tear off those sunrooms off the back. And when you see what they did with them, it's just man, that's, if I lived here and I could have stretched out my undergraduate years further than I did, I'd still be drinking coffee on this subject. Got to talk about this building behind us. It was, you know, necessity was the mother of building in this instance. The necessity wasn't a consensus, however, when this building was built in the late 1800s. This building was actually built in 1895. It was a forerunning location of Central High School, Detroit Central High School.
Oh wow, okay.
There were several locations of Central High School. This is one of the most prominent and one of the ones that has lasted. But it was built when David Mackenzie actually approached others to invest and have this building built. It was built for high school purposes, secondary education purposes. Excuse me, secondary education in the 1890s was not a popular idea. Didn't really become a prominent idea graduating from high school until World War II. But there was definitely a need. The population was growing. You know, kids who were growing up in the city, the belief was that, the need was there to continue their education and have some sort of bridge between younger years and more adult education. So adult education classes were actually introduced, and it became something of a city college as you got into the early 1900s and the early 19-teens and 20s. The idea really caught fire, and so these adult education courses really continued to expand. They were business courses and history courses and sociology courses, and it expanded to such an extent that in the 1950s it actually was chartered as Wayne University by the county. This, you know, and as Gary already said, the university was making its mark and taking things over and tearing buildings down and building more of their buildings in that central part of the camp, was now Central Campus, but Old Main was still in use as a school building. When the university actually, when the state actually chartered this, or it was pursued as a state university, was when in the 1960s this eventually became Wayne State University. Again, still in use, still classrooms throughout. It also now houses the geology department, the archaeology department, the astronomy department. For a time, it actually housed the dance department, which has since moved over into the Hillberry of Warrington. It was a school building when I was here. Yes, I was a Wayne State Tartar before they started calling them the Warriors. I was here when it was a Tartar, 1985 to 1990. I stuck around for a little bit, and I believe that it's still the building, even though it's been loved on and kept up and refurbished. It still is hot in the winter and hot in the summer. It still is heated largely by steam heat. It's still sprawling. When I would show up for class in classroom 80 on the north side of the building, my next class was in classroom 81. It was all the way on the other side of the building. I don't know why, but that was the design of the classroom. But it has these really fantastic amenities, not just the styling of it and the dormers and the turrets. The water fountains are Pewabic tile water fountains. There's all this tremendous
plasterwork again, and sculpted corners and things like that throughout the building. And again, it is still a very active school building for Wayne State. And I don't think it's ever been anything in my history, anything other than Old Main. It's always been Old Main. It's like, that's always going to be the Cass Corridor to me. I don't care what anybody says, what anybody calls it. I don't care if they try and rebrand it as Midtown. That's the Cass Corridor, and that's Old Main. Anyway, it's still a really terrific structure. During I think only during the active semesters, so like the winter and fall semesters, they usually have a grad student in astrophysics who gives lectures on the area's constellations, because there's an active planetarium in the basement of the building. And so on Friday nights, for free, it's first come, first served, you can come down and see and hear a full-on explanation by a graduate astrophysicist of the southeastern sky of Michigan. It's pretty extraordinary. Okay, so again, because it's a neighborhood and has a whole population here.
Bitch, you want to smoke cigarettes every day?
It's, you know, life is made up of every kind of human, even some who aren't happy on Saturdays and a Sunday. So right across the street is another example of the terrific churches in the city or in this neighborhood. So this is the first Unitarian Universalist. When this church was built, and it still has a lot of these same features, in the basement there is actually an auditorium that was refurbished recently, like in the last 8 or 10 years. They upgraded the sound system there, and they upgraded the sound system in the sanctuary as well, which you can't tell from standing out here, but I urge you on nights like Noel Night, which is around December 3rd every year. This church is open, and there's usually entertainment going on in there. Thornetta Davis is usually performing there, and if you haven't seen Thornetta live, you really should. She is my queen of the blues. She's Detroit's queen of the blues. I don't know if everybody believes she's the queen of the blues. I think she is.
Sure they
anyway,
do.
She performs there, and what you can't see from out here is how beautiful the stained glass window is on the inside, because it's all covered to keep it safe, and it's got these smudgy windows. And then the ceiling of the church is designed, it looks like an old German church, really, where it's got all these wooden cross beams that line the entire sanctuary. So even just if you like old buildings, if you like old churches, you get an opportunity to check it out, don't let the cover tell you what's in the book. It really is something. And it's still a congregation to an extent. It's pretty, you know, as the sign says, it's not Unitarian anymore, but it is more Universalist than that. They're a lot of what they do, while they are a gathering congregation, they're a social service community, so they have a lot of different communities that meet there and operate out of there as well, operate some of their endeavors out there. 1895, and it was built for William Boydell, and it was built to house 2 families independently, but right next door to one. Boydell was in the paint and varnish business, and again, as things were growing in the city, his business increases because industry needs what he's selling, and eventually the business moved downriver and was snapped up in the 80s, I believe, by a little company called BASF. And so there are a lot of companies in Detroit and in Michigan in general that had their start right here and branched out to the world, and that's another good example of it. Speaking of branching out in the world, so Perry McAdoo, who originally had this house built across the street, Perry left this area and went off to make his fortunes literally. And where he went before 1884, when he had this house built, was Billings, Montana? Yes, Billings, Montana. So Perry's out in Billings, and he's mining gold, and he's cutting timber, and he's just making a boatload of cash. And at some point, he meets who would be his future wife, Clara. And he says to Clara, you know, and again, these are terrible paraphrases. I wasn't there. This is what I've discovered or discerned over the years. Here he says, you know, honey, we should build a new house befitting our station. We have all this money now. We should build it in a cosmopolitan city, and we should go and live there and have a wonderful life. And Clara said, well, where do you want to build it? He said, let's go to Detroit. Detroit. There's nothing in Detroit. Well, sure, no, there are things there. Houses are being built, and, you know, there's some old farmland that's available. So Clara, I guess, relented, and this house across the street was built. It was a private residence, like a lot of these places were, for a good number of years. And, excuse me, this was built in 1891. Eventually, it was sold to the church after the church was built and became the parish house. The church actually had services in here until that was finished. But it served as the parish house for a long time. It's still a meeting house for different organizations. It's just a neat example of late 1800s architecture in the area. Excuse me, in the area. And if you're terrifically bored later and you need a phrase that sticks in your head to share with your friends and loved ones, it has a unique artistic feature, architectural feature. This railing around this dormer on the left-hand side is known as a balustraded parapet. I don't know why. I don't know really what that means. I was a history major. And we dumb lawyers, we don't know things like that either. So that is a balustraded parapet. It's a unique architectural design. You can't walk out onto that balcony, but it was meant as some ornamentation. Really important to point out, not the least of which are Traffic Jam and Snug. And you guys mentioned Motor City Brewing. Starting with Motor City Brewing, when John Lindardus, who's an artist, first established this place, it was actually one of the first microbreweries in the city of Detroit, and the first brewery that, first new brewery in the city since Prohibition. And now, you know, you've got, well, you had, of course, Traffic Jam and Snug also became a microbrewery. And we have actually several distilleries in the city as well as multiple breweries since that time. Like the 1990s, that was the very first one. So in 70 years, there had been no new, there wasn't either the call for it, or there wasn't the interest, or there wasn't the, you know, unique talents that once again an artist brought to this area. I think John is a sculptor, an artist. Right across the street. Oh, and actually, their pizza, they have a wood fire oven as well. So they have the, you know, the 900-degree makes pizza in 90 seconds, and they have pretty
like Bigelow.
Yeah, yep. Okay. And they have terrific beer to go along with it.
Really good food.
Yep, agreed. Right across the street is what has come to be known, because it wasn't always called that. It used to be called the Dog House Saloon. It actually used to be a couple of disconnected houses. You remember, it was a neighborhood. And those houses kind of combined and got intertwined and became the Dog House Saloon in the 40s. Fast forward to the 60s, and the name was changed to Traffic Jam and Snug. But that name has a bit of, everything's got a story, and certainly this is one of them. So a traffic jam, or this traffic jam, actually allegedly arose out of somebody commenting on how small the space was and how many people were packed into it around the bar. It was like a traffic jam. And then as far as a snug is concerned, if you're not familiar with the term, frequently that term appears in European pubs, particularly British or Scottish or Irish pubs. It is a small side room that typically was for women to drink discreetly in, and clergy, because you didn't want your priest drinking with your wife in the bar while you were there, right? So that's my thought. In any event, that's a snug. It's also a place typically where some food was served. So traffic jam, bar, and snug, the spot where people would sit and eat. So it was originally owned, when it became Traffic Jam, it had been purchased by a couple of Cass Tech high school teachers. It was a super busy, super popular place because you have this university right up the street. You got people who live in the neighborhood.
And
it
nothing
was,
else.
And nothing else, right? That's right. You know best, honestly. And so, at some point, as the story goes, terrible night. Service was crazy. People all over the place. How you doing? And somebody yelled out, "Does anybody want to buy a bar?" And in this crowd, apparently, were some of the service staff. So this would have been Carolyn and Ben who own the restaurant now. And the answer from them eventually was yes, we do want to buy it. So they purchased it, and they really started a revolution in that particular spot, Gesundheit. So they started producing their own artisanal cheeses and dairy products, their own handmade artisanal bread, their own beer. So they produced their own beer, expanded the menu, expanded the inside footprint of the restaurant, and it just continued. It's been a mainstay since that time. However, in 2022, there was a fire, and it really damaged 3/4 of the inside with smoke damage, and there was some structural damage. The hope is that it will reopen, and as I mentioned earlier on when we were talking back at Jolly Pumpkin, the owners have done a couple of pop-ups at different restaurants, but we're still not sure what's going to happen. We're actually going to see a house further down the street that the owners of Traffic Jam own and have been redeveloping. They own several properties, but we're still not sure about this. But it gives me an opportunity to point out what is the motto of the city of Detroit. That's at least what the motto is in English, and that has been the motto since the 1800s, after Father Gabriel Richard coined it, after the city of Detroit burned to the ground, and that is, "We hope for better things, it shall rise from the ashes." That is the official motto of the city of Detroit. And in Latin, I'll try not to slaughter it. I do speak Spanish, but my Latin is not so great. Speramus meliora, resurgit cineribus. So we hope for better days, it'll rise from the ashes. So we really hope so. On the outside, it still has some interesting decor. It's got some interesting planters on it, which if you look closely, look like something you might recognize, maybe not. If you consider what the men's room looked like at Tiger Stadium when you were a kid, when it was still there, some rather trough-like receptacles, that's what those are. And then on the side, those are more of the sinks, and they form water features. But I point those out. Adaptive reuse at its, well, not its best, but adaptive reuse.
Actually, the one's from Tiger Stadium?
Yeah.
Or
This is definitely from Tiger Stadium.
Okay.
So, let's walk across the street. Careful. As we're walking, if you don't notice it already, take a look at the street itself, like the surface of the street. Take a look at the abundance of trees that form this canopy all the way down. Consider that although there are similar architectural styles, every single house on this block is unique. You have sort of a circumstance where not only is every house unique, there's actually a structure on the block where you can say one of these is not like the other, and we'll see that in a minute. We are stopping at a spot that I think is not just because it's the beginning of this district for us, but an interesting spot to point out a few houses. This house was originally built by John Scott, who was an architect as well, designed by John Scott, and a mentor of, yes, Albert Kahn. John built the house next door, though, for himself. So this is built in the East Coast stick style, and up until maybe 8 or 9 years ago, didn't look as magnificent as it does now. It looked good. I mean, there's been a lot of attention and love and care for all these houses over the years. Certainly since A certain person that I'll talk about moved into the neighborhood in the 60s, but Jason, who owns this house, went to extraordinary lengths to restore it, including pulling all the siding off, pulling all that gingerbread off, finding out what the paint colors, the original paint colors were, as closely as he could, and matching them. There's the house right next door, which of course looks like an entirely different style, built in it's high Victorian style. Again, morning, good afternoon actually. Interesting feature about this house and the houses like it, where you see the dormers and the windows on the 3rd floor. It isn't just another pretty face. It was built 3 floors on purpose. It was built well, because of property taxes. It was built that way. You could build a house that tall with 3 stories on it if the 3rd story was not considered living space. Although it's huge, that's probably 10 feet tall ceilings. You could live in that space, and someone probably does. But it wasn't considered livable space, and therefore the house was only taxed for 2 stories. So there's a method to the madness, and certainly there is more so when taxes are involved. Right across the street, this house, after it came into the ownership of a particular person, really was the impetus and the flashpoint for this area being designated as an historic district. It actually was designated as the first historic district in the city of Detroit, the West Canfield Historic District. So when that house was built in the 1870s, it was built for Colin Fox, who was the superintendent of Western Telegraph. He lived there for a number of years. It went through subsequent ownership since that time. And in the 1960s, a woman by the name of Beulah Grown Croxford, she's a retired school teacher. She used to spend a lot of time at estate sales. A lot of them in this area and elsewhere. And she was at an estate sale one day, and typically she'd stop and she'd pick up knickknacks and things like that. There was an estate sale going on at this house in particular, and it turns out also the house was for sale. And so she quickly reached out, I guess when she got home, to her husband Reggie, and she said, "Reggie, we're buying a house." That's the kind of person that Beulah was. We're buying a house. And sure enough, Beulah and Reggie bought this house. The houses in the area were in varying states of repair and disrepair. After they had built and had families lived in them, as the city went through tough times, as the area went through tough times, they got subdivided into boarding houses. And as populations moved in and out, and demographics changed, and business went away, the business that moved in at times was less than stellar. You had a lot of brothels in this area. This house across the street in particular was a brothel when Beulah moved in, Beulah and Reggie moved in. Beulah had started an organization called the Anti-Prostitution Association, something along those lines. Nevertheless, she was a decent human and cared about other humans, and she also cared about the architecture. So I'm not sure which one predominated in Beulah, but as legend has it, she went next door when she learned that there was going to be a raid on this brothel one night. And in an effort to preserve those 2 doors on the right-hand side, those original doors on the right-hand side, the entry of the house, she said, "Do me a favor, leave those doors unlocked." And sure enough, police raid shows up, police rush in. They didn't have to break down those doors and take those out. Those are original 1880s doors on that house.
And that's preservation at its finest.
Preservation at its finest, absolutely. So Beulah's bent really was right from the start to advocate for preservation of these homes, for increased preservation of these homes. National, was it? Animal Kingdom, or
yeah.
I'm trying to remember the name of the show. Showing my age for sure. Was the preservation of these homes, and so folks who were already making a go of it were approached. Folks who weren't making a go of it were approached, and bit by bit, houses began to be upgraded, not changed,
because what you're seeing here, these facades, these structures, this is how they were built. And the people who lived here, as I mentioned when we started, they were professionals. They were lawyers and doctors and ministers and superintendents of telegraph companies and dentists. I played it. So let's keep walking. As we move, I'll tell you about one night when Jason and his buddy Michael stopped into a bar where I was having a drink with my friend. The bar is called the Kiesling, and it's up Gesundheit. It's in the Milwaukee Junction area, so up by the Boulevard in Woodward. And it's on, I think it's on Baltimore, actually. And it's a couple streets in. It's close to where the girl with the D earring is, where that huge mural is. And my friend and I are sitting at the bar. It's a corner bar, and the door is open. It's about 10:30, 11 o'clock at night. We're enjoying our beverage, just kind of talking to the bartender. And these two guys walk in, looking like they'd had a hell of a day. And they sit down at the corner, and they both get a double shot of something. I think Jason's was a bourbon with a big block of ice in it, and I think Michael took his neat. And we're just, we're curious people, so my friend and I said, well, what's going on? What happened to you? What's going on with you guys today? He said, oh man, quite a day. Well, what happened? Well, we live over on West Canfield, and the street blew up. So what are you talking about the street blew up? A water main that had been installed in the 1880s that's about this tall, and was the original water main, exploded. And it blew all these bricks up into the air, filled the street with about a foot of water. And I said, my God, we live in these historic homes, do you have basements? I mean, what happened to the lower levels? He said, actually, we all lucked out. Nothing. Just all this water filled the street. So you can see it was eventually restored, but that was quite a moment when these guys walked in, and I thought, this beautiful block, what just happened, what's going to happen? Is this the unintended and unexpected demise of this block? So, as I mentioned, you have an instance where one of these is not like the other. So you look at these houses, you look across the street, that's not exactly a house. Well, it is, because it's multiple condos. But that was originally built as a single-family home. But Dr. Valpy and his wife, before he died, actually, I've learned, the idea was to have something of passive income even then. So this is late 1800s, early 1900s. And so the plan was to tear down their house and build an apartment building. They would live in one and they would rent out the others. Well, Dr. Valpy died. And here you have a widow, right? Late 1800s, early 1900s. No pensions, no Social Security. What are you going to do? Well, finish the building. Finish the building, live in one, rent out the others. And it worked. And so Mrs. Valpy lived there until she died. It eventually changed hands, etc., and eventually became, I think in 1995, that was built into lofts. So those are all not lofts, but those are all, I think there are 6 condos in there now. A couple of these are subdivided. This is subdivided into apartments. I don't think the house next door, I thought they were going to. This house, I believe, and again, some of these things are legend. So during a little government police action that didn't last back in the early 1900s, called Prohibition, there were, you may have heard this statistic, before Prohibition, there were maybe 300 bars and pubs in the city of Detroit, and after Prohibition, there was something like 3,500. Most illegal, if not all illegal. A lot of them, and the term was a blind pig. These secret spots where you could go to drink if you had the password. Allegedly, this little corner green door where the pineapple is on the side, this was a blind pig. It's a private home now. I'd knock on the door and ask the owners, but I just think it's rude. So, my recollection is no house on this block has been torn down except for one, and it was on this spot.
So this owner actually succeeded, and I don't remember when it occurred. It was the only open spot on this whole block, and it's as a result of one house being torn down in the whole history of this block. I thought this was a fraternity house at some point. I think it's not now, but I think it was. It used to have Greek letters on the front of it. Sorry, I know you guys are fighting the allergens right now. We're walking right through all these trees. So bear with me, we're just about there. This house across the street, this is the one that the owners of Traffic Jam own as well. And what's remarkable about it is it sat there empty and literally growing algae on the outside of it for decades. And it looked like it was headed for the wrecking ball. It wasn't, you know, the structure was sound, it looked like, but it was dark, and moss covered, and nobody lived there. It looked like
the stone was black.
Yeah, and black. I mean, it's just the building had turned black from just the elements and years. So when they purchased it, I mean, you can see how different it looks now. Not only is it that same reddish brick that what do you think that is?
Sandstone.
Sandstone. They've actually painted the grout in between the bricks as well, so they brought out all that coloration in the bricks. They've also, put all the copper fascia around the dormers, replaced the windows. I'm sure they replaced the guts, as far as the HVAC and everything is concerned. One of the reasons that they couldn't do anything with it is it had no driveway. It had no driveway, it had no garage, it had no alley to speak of behind it. You couldn't park there. And you can't park on this side of the street. But they bought it. I think the idea is actually to turn it into 2, if not 4 spaces. I can't remember what the plan is, but that's definitely an example of somebody deciding, okay, I know no one's done anything with this. I have an idea. Let's see if we can make it work. So we are right at the corner of another important corner of the 3rd Avenue and Canfield area, the historic West Canfield. They'll talk about it in a second. But we can't turn this corner or step to the corner until I tell you what happened with what's going on with this street. So when we got here, this street went all the way through. So from Woodward through where these apartment and townhouse buildings are now. This is the throughway, 3rd and Weston. And like any throughway, people taking a shortcut through a neighborhood, people would zip down here at top speed, 40, 50 miles an hour, because they could. You couldn't do anything about it. What was the city going to do? No one put in speed bumps. Really, nothing was done to alter that until Beulah got the idea. She became aware that these bricks, or that a storehouse of bricks, was being held at historic Fort Wayne in Southwest Detroit, and these bricks had been uncovered when they were digging the hole for the Renaissance Center down by the river, and this was brickwork that actually lined Atwater. I am told. Well, she heard about these bricks, and she struck upon the idea that if we lined this with bricks, it would be beautiful. And if you went over 20 miles an hour down this street, you would shake out the undercarriage of the car and your kidneys. So she talked some people into it. She's a very persuasive lady, and one by one, they replaced these bricks from 3rd all the way down to 2nd. And now you cannot go fast down the street. It actually deadens a lot of the sound as well. It certainly adds some aesthetic, to the street together with the tree canopy. This place, when I say it's one of the most intact blocks of this kind of architecture and structure in the city, it's for all of those reasons, not the least of which was Beulah. So, all right, quick peek around the corner. This area fell on some pretty hard times, and things changed significantly, and folks who were just trying to make it turned to some other businesses. This area, especially in the 50s and 60s, really became a spot of a high crime area.
but crime primarily of vice, prostitution, drugs, what was called loitering, which, my opinion is it became an excuse for cops to do certain things. But nevertheless, it was a tough area, and it was popular though. If you wanted to go have a drink in the middle of the day with your buddies from GM, you might roll up third to Anderson Garden Bar, which used to be right down the street, where the Wake Cafe is right now. Anderson Garden was a tough spot, like a lot of the places on this street. It got raided all the time, but it was the kind of place that got raided. You handed some money over to the authorities, and then they left. It was just that kind of relationship. These are all allegations. I'm a lawyer. I say allegedly. That's my vocabulary, right? So tough times in this area. Area is just not really surviving, except in a very tough state. And a woman by the name of Mary Lou Brown comes to town. And Mary Lou was a pretty extraordinary human. She actually was from the Saginaw area originally, but then moved out to California. She was charismatic and beautiful, and she was a stellar salesperson. She sold home goods primarily. She sold insurance for a while, made a ton of money, and then I can't remember the order. It was either she found Jesus and met a man, or she met a man and found Jesus. Either way, the man said he had gotten the calling. So that kind of fit. Mary Lou said, well, me too. What are we going to do about it? Well, there's this tough area that I know of, this neighborhood in Detroit. Let's go see if we can do some good. So they come to this area. The boyfriend had not found Jesus. Mary Lou actually did have the calling. And so she set about to help in this area in any way that she could work out. So, good luck. So her first endeavor was to kind of see the landscape, kind of see what was going on, what her possibilities were. So she stops into this house across the street. This was owned by a private owner. And she said, it's a beautiful house. I'm thinking about doing some things in the area. I'd like to buy your house. The owner said, nope, close the door in her face. So she goes a little bit further down the block to this stretch of buildings. And at the time, there was an electrical supply shop, a tinsmith, and another kind of workshop.
There's a bar in there.
In this, right, down on the lower level. And then on the upstairs, there were, at least as reported by somebody who was part of the organization, and I can't remember the order, a brothel, a Black Panther's office, and an office of the Communist Party. And so Mary Lou approached the landlord and owner of the building and said, well, you got an interesting setup here. Can you tell me who's not paying their rent? Not casting aspersions, but it happened to be the Communist Party. Not paying their rent. So as the story goes, Mary Lou grabbed up a bunch of boxes. She walked up into the offices the door was open for the Communist Party offices, and she started packing up their stuff. No one told her she could do this, no one told her to do this, but she starts packing up their stuff, and then reportedly she said the largest shadow she's ever been covered by in her life appeared behind her, and she turned around. She was the biggest human she'd ever seen in her life. This guy was standing here looking down at her, and he says, what are you doing? And she said, well, I'm packing and you're moving. And as the story goes, he said, okay. And he left. So she was able to negotiate with the landlord, buy this building, and start to create the Mary Lou Brown Ministries. And so she bought this building. She eventually convinced the owner to sell her this house for $13,000. She bought this building, which was a former Packard motor car showroom. She got a group of people together, and as legend has it, in the style of the Temple of Jericho, they circled the building 3 times, and the building fell down. She was 4 times short, because I think it was 7 times around the Temple of Jericho. So
and she convinced the owner to give her that building for $1. They amassed additional properties, and the ministry still exists today. Brown Ministry still exists today. They still serve this community. They're an educational ministry. They're a social outreach ministry. They still have a fundraiser where they take a small group of kids up to a farm property that they own up in the middle of the state. Kids who have never been out of the city or never seen what a working farm is like. Mary Lou lived to 2019, and she died at 97 years old. So, again, people come into an area with an idea. There were already people living there who were trying to make a go of it. Efforts were combined and things succeeded, and industries and histories and lives move on. But we are going to actually go back down Canfield, back to the Jolly Pumpkin spot. But again, I encourage you to walk around, drive around, bike around this neighborhood.